So I am delighted today to be introducing our speaker, Toby Lowe. You are in for a real treat. Toby is the visiting professor at the Centre for Public Impact, which is an international social enterprise whose aim is to transform government. Toby spent 15 years working across public and voluntary sectors in the UK, working in both policy and delivery roles, including some time as a civil servant on place-based regeneration projects and some time as a chief executive of an arts-based charity, working with people with complex needs. He's currently on secondment from Newcastle Business School to the Centre for Public Impact, and he is one of the UK's leading thinkers about how to effectively govern and manage public services in the context of complexity. But part of what I love about Toby is that he is an academic whose interest is all rooted in practical and pragmatic change. Indeed, I still remember a conversation with him where we were talking about the need for a paradigm shift in how public services are managed, when he reminded me, Ruth, you don't get fundamental shifts by talking about them. You get them by finding people who want to make them and then getting on and demonstrating better in practice. And that's in part why we've been working with him and his colleagues at the Centre for Public Impact for the last couple of years. And I'm delighted that he's agreed to do this session for us today for our international QI Connect audience. Like all our speakers, he has given of his time freely today. So with no further ado, Toby, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. Now, let me see if I can make my slides work. Hopefully now people can see my slides. So yes, what I'm going to present to you today is kind of what we found from 8 years of doing action research alongside different public service organisations from across the world. And this work was inspired by the kind of 15 years work prior to that, working across different bits of public service and the voluntary sector in the UK. So what I'm going to talk to you about, my main question is, what's the relationship between quality improvement and public management? Because I'm interested in how we can do public management that enables quality improvement to do the kind of learning and improvement job that it aspires to. And I'm going to talk you through approaches, results-based management approaches to learning, the evidence on the relationship between performance management and learning, and then how we can manage for good outcomes. I'm going to explore with you this idea of learning as a management strategy, and then some things that I've noticed about the kind of relationships between quality improvement and doing public management differently. And then finally, I'm going to talk you through some examples of doing public management differently in practice that help maybe kind of bring to life some of this sense of what it means to do public management differently. So which elements of public management thinking and practice should we focus on? And so I'm most curious to start by taking a look at the relationship, the thinking and practice around performance management. And this is partly inspired by hearing a presentation about quality improvement in the health service from Professor Stephen Singleton, a presentation that he gave to the North East and North Cumbria Integrated Care Board late last year. And so he was kind of outlining kind of quality improvement in healthcare methods and ways to think about learning in health systems. And he finished with an exhortation and asked, almost like a plea to managers, to focus more on learning and less on performance management. And so I thought, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to explore the relationship between learning and performance management? Because he seems to be saying that doing more of one is at the expense of another. So what do we know about the relationship between performance management and learning? Let's look at how we performance management for outcomes, and let's see the impact of that on learning. So you'll be probably very familiar with these. This is a from the textbook on how to measure outcomes and manage for results. It's a program logic model that presents a linear view of the relationship between an organization's activity and the outcomes that they desire. And there are kind of learning processes inherent in this, developing and using these kind of logic models. So the idea is that we use evidence to develop this delivery chain, this logic model by which an outcome is made, and then break that evidence down into individual steps in the process, the resources required, the program processes, the output, and then use that evidence to identify appropriate performance indicators for each of those steps. And the idea of this is to create an evidence-based delivery chain which is generalizable, so that it's true across different times and places. And from a performance management perspective, what's happening here is that the idea is that managers can create a framework, so by if the people and organizations they manage hit those indicators, you will deliver the desired outcome. When we think about this as a learning process, there is learning in the initial process of finding evidence to create appropriate indicators. There's learning about local context to establish the correct baselines for those indicators. So what's the starting point for that indicator in this context? And then the process of performance of capturing performance data is a process of learning. And then what happens is that kind of performance management processes kick in for this idea of course correction by using performance incentives to change actions. So the idea is that people, teams, organizations are rewarded through promotion, through renewed contracts, if they hit the appropriate performance indicators, and punished. So you don't get the chance for promotion, or your organization doesn't get to the next contract renewal. And that is the way that performance is changed. So, and the crucial thing about this is that the reward and punishment is a key part of this learning process. And what it does is it conflates the learning processes with performance management processes. And I want to present you now with a bunch of evidence that shows what happens when you conflate learning processes with performance management processes. And this is how I'm going to present you with some evidence from across the disciplines of public management and performance management as an academic discipline. So the first thing that performance management does in relation to learning is it slows learning down, rendering it ineffective in complex environments. So there was a paper published in 2014 asking the question, is performance management and management fit for the future? And they were particularly asking, does it work in complex dynamic environments? And the conclusion of this paper was them saying that we are no longer certain that we as leaders in organizations can adequately define measures and targets in a volatile environment to assess managers without constraining the speed of decision making and action that we need to be successful. So what's happening here is that by the time, imagine how long it takes to set appropriate performance indicators that relate to the strategy that your organization has spent kind of 12 months delivering. And then it takes time to capture data about those performance indicators and to set appropriate baselines. In complex dynamic environments, that process is too long to enable the rapid adaptation and learning that is required in complex environments. So let's think about what happened during COVID and think about, like, is it sensible to try and direct people's activity using the performance objectives that were embedded in the strategies that people had developed? No, it wasn't sensible. Those are inappropriate tools for using learning in complex environments. Secondly, and more seriously, performance management corrupts the data that is required for learning. So the first time that evidence around this surfaced was in 1979 in a very famous essay called Assessing the Impact of Planned Social Change by an American academic called Donald Campbell. He created something that became called Campbell's Law. The more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the processes it is intended to monitor. So you can see how this undercuts the very basis of target-based performance management. And we know that Campbell's Law stands up because of various systematic reviews done in the academic discipline of performance management. So this is one of the latest from 2018. Say a systematic review. So if you're into your hierarchy of evidence, the highest form of academic evidence there is, systematic review of research into the effects of target-based performance management found that over 80% of studies find evidence of gaming, so deliberate manipulation of data, and 3/4 nearly find evidence of people deliberately lying. So what happens when people use target-based performance management? It corrupts the data that we need to learn, therefore rendering that data useless. So picking up where Stephen Singleton left off, we need to do more than exhort managers to do less performance management and more learning. What we can do is create an approach to performance management that is built on and enables continuous learning. And it's that I'm going to explore with you now. Because this is the work that we've been doing across the world, and most recently with the teams at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, on developing an alternative approach to public management that we call human learning systems, one that deals with the complexity of real world environments. And so one of the questions that we ask is, how can we make continuous learning the basis of our public management approach? And so to dig into that, we need to ask the question, okay, what is it we need to learn about when we're doing public service? And we think the crucial question to ask is, how is an outcome created? Because what we're assuming here is that everyone agrees that the purpose of public service is to help people create good outcomes in their lives. And if we all agree that the purpose of public service is to help people create good outcomes in their lives, then understanding how outcomes are actually made is crucial, because how we manage public service should respond to this answer. And this is our best articulation of how an outcome is made. So if you have a public health background at all, you may be familiar with this diagram. This is a systems map of the outcome of obesity. It was originally produced by the UK Government Office for Science in 2007. It's what happens when you shut a bunch of public health people in a room together and say, you're not allowed out until you've mapped all the causes of obesity and all the relationships between all of those causes. What happened is that they identified 108 different factors that lead to the outcome of obesity. You can't see the individual factors on this map, it's too kind of small scale, but you can see those factors summed up into things like early life experiences and food production and supply and macroeconomic drivers and education and media and technology and the nature of work and the built environment. And down here in the bottom right hand corner of this system, 4 factors out of 108 are healthcare and treatment options. And so what this work brilliantly demonstrates is that outcomes are the product of whole systems like this. So all 108 factors operating interdependently, that is how an outcome is made. And you will see how few of those factors are to do with healthcare and treatment options. So if that is a representation of how an outcome is created at a population scale, how do we understand an outcome that is created in each and every person's life? Because once we understand that outcomes are emergent properties of complex systems like this, then we need to understand that each person's life is a unique complex system that creates outcomes. Unfortunately, we can turn to the world of psychology and ecological systems theory for a representation of how that works. And in particular, we can see the different layers of complex systems around a person that are the means by which outcomes are created. So at the heart of an individual's life as a system is themselves. And then there is a microsystem around them, their family, their peers, their workplace, etc. And then as we go out further layers, we can see that there are as an exosystem layer of their local amenities, their local health resources, the policies of their local authority, and then out more broadly still into the societal culture and ideologies and laws and economic structure, etc., etc., etc. And so you can see the different layers around a person that enables us to represent each person's unique life as a complex system. And understanding each person's unique life as a complex system is crucial, because my peers are different to your peers. My family is different to your family. And so to understand the complex system that creates an outcome in your life and that's different to the complex system that creates an outcome in my life is crucial if we are to help people create genuine outcomes in their lives. So what this means for public management is that management needs to enable these layers of complex systems to learn and respond to each person's unique life as a complex system, because that is the process of how outcomes are made. What this requires is a process of kind of letting go of the management fantasy that we've created for ourselves, that if we do process A hard enough and consistently enough and the same each time, what we will get is outcome B. The world will be a brilliant place, much easier to manage if that were true, but unfortunately that isn't true. The complexity of our lives means that what we need to do is to open the door to the reality of how outcomes are made, if that is what we're interested in, and deal with the implications of that, of the seeing our lives as complex systems. So if that's the reality of how the world works, how can public management respond to that reality? And what we've seen organisations do, and this is kind of, I think, becomes supremely relevant to the quality improvement processes, what we've seen organisations adopt is this idea of learning as a management strategy. And I'll talk you through that now. So learning as a management strategy starts by framing the work of public-facing workers as learning cycles. So what it means is that a public-facing worker, whether that's a doctor or a nurse or a teacher or an employment advisor, their first job is to form a relationship with the person that they're serving and understand their life as a complex system that is either producing a desired outcome or frustrating the production of that desired outcome. And then when those people, that the public service worker and the person that they're serving, have a decent understanding of their life as a system in respect of that particular outcome, what they can do is co-design experiments and explorations to see whether they can get that life to produce a different pattern of results, a different outcome. Then they run those experiments and explorations and take what works and what doesn't and embed that as behavioural change in that person's life and structural change in the factors around their life. So let me bring this idea to life a little bit. Let's say my job is to help you as a person who's experiencing chronic pain in your life. So the first thing we would do is I would try and build up a picture of your life that's currently producing the outcome of chronic pain. So I might ask you questions like, do you experience the pain more in the morning or the evenings? Do you experience it when you're at work or at home? Do you experience it when you make this kind of action or this kind of action? Do you experience it when you eat these kind of foods or those kind of foods? Together, we build up a picture of your life as a complex system that is currently producing the outcome of chronic pain. And then we can, together, design some experiments and explorations to see whether we can get your life to produce a different pattern of results, not chronic pain. So we could say, what happens if we fit this enablement equipment to your house? What happens if we try this diet rather than that diet? What happens if we try these physiotherapy techniques? What happens if we try joining this walking group? All of these things, these experiments, explorations, we can try in your life to see whether we can get your unique life as a complex system to produce a different pattern of results. And we draw on evidence from other contexts, because that evidence is likely to be important and relevant for your context, but we don't treat it as we know that this will work, because your life is a unique complex system that has a different set of characteristics from that in which the evidence is created. So we need to do experiments and explorations in your unique life as a complex system. So, and we run those and we take the results of those and we embed what we learn about what works and what doesn't in your life as behavioural and structural change. And it is in this way that public service can respond to the ways in which outcomes are actually created in people's real lives. because it is by framing public-facing work as this kind of learning cycle, it enables public service to produce bespoke responses that are relevant and appropriate to each and every person's unique life as a complex system. And that is the process of how outcomes are made. So it is this process that we are required to manage if what we care about is creating outcomes in people's lives. So that's what learning as a management strategy looks like at the kind of system scale of a person's life and the interaction with a worker who serves them. But as we saw before, there are all sorts of different scales to the idea of complex systems. So a person's life is a system. A team of people that support that person is a system. That organization is a system of teams. A place that organization is in is a system of organizations. The country that they're in is a system of places, right? There are these layers of complex systems which all contribute to achieving an outcome in someone's life. What we find is that it is this same learning cycle that is operated at each of these different system scales. And crucially, what happens is that people make connections between the learning cycles at different scales. So let's say that there's a team of workers all supporting people with chronic pain. So the team has maybe 50 of these learning cycles going on at any one time, each with the different clients that the citizens that they're supporting. So on the ground, you have these 50 different learning cycles of different experiments being undertaken to how chronic pain can be addressed in different people's lives. What this continuous frame of experimentations is producing is learning which challenges the business as usual for how the team is organized and how that organization operates. And so the job at the team leader scale is to run a learning cycle which takes the learning from across all of the different patterns of all of the different learning cycles of the work on the ground and says, okay, what patterns do we learn? Do we see in all of these experiments? What do we need to do to change how we work to enable this stuff to work better? So these are some of the questions that might, at team scale, you might ask. What are the maximum caseloads for workers that enable them to run these learning cycles well? What information systems do we need as an organization in order to share knowledge across all of the different experiments that are happening? What shared reflective practice spaces do we need to create to enable our members of our team to talk with each other about all the experiments that are happening? What staff capabilities do we need to recruit and train for to enable us to run these the work as learning cycles? It is these kinds of questions are likely to be the content of the learning cycles at the team scale. And you can see how this interconnected learning cycles becomes a different way to manage public service. And then when this learning as a management strategy is enacted most fully, what you get is this connected stack of learning cycles from the ground up, so from the public-facing work right up through to the minister, where each higher scale is seeking to learn from the challenges and the experiments that are happening at the scale below. So returning to our performance management lens, this gives us some alternative performance management questions to ask, because what then the processes that are being managed are those that enable these learning cycles to function and the connections between these learning cycles. That is what is managed, and so that is the performance that requires management. So the performance management can ask these kind of questions. Who needs an account of these learning and adaptation processes? And how should that account be rendered? So what is happening in each of these learning cycles? What is the work being done? And we can ask more detailed questions to understand whether these learning cycles are being operated properly. So does it have the resources that it needs to operate effectively? Is it connected to other learning cycles appropriately? What is the integrity of the learning and adaptation processes? Are lessons being learned? How is learning translating into change practice, to change processes and changed infrastructure? Who is included and excluded from those learning cycles? And are those boundaries correct? These become some of the different types of performance management questions when what is being managed are these processes of learning. So this is what learning as a management strategy really looks like for organizations. So next, I just want to say some things that I've noticed about the relationship between quality improvement and public management. Firstly, what we're seeking here is to change the purpose of management from control over implementations of programs to coordination of learning. And this represents a paradigm shift in how public management is done. And essentially, one of the key aspects of this paradigm shift is we really need to choose. Do we believe in the importance of continuous learning or not? Because if we really believe in the importance of continuous learning, the evidence says we can't have effective learning and retain our approaches to performance management, target-based performance management as we do at the moment. Because remember, those processes slow learning down and they distort the data required to learn. So we do need to choose. Secondly, quality improvement and this human learning systems approach we're talking about seem to share some really common ideas and practices. So the kind of plan, do, study, act and adapt cycle of quality improvement shares a bunch of really similar features to the human learning systems learning cycle, right? And what we've found from doing this work in practice with our Healthcare Improvement Scotland colleagues is that QI methods are a crucial part of the human learning systems approach. So the practices of continuous improvement are the bedrock of effective public service, and particularly this rigorous approach to experimentation and exploration that kind of comes from a QI base. I mean, it's also important to say that rigorous in this context means rigorous appropriate to methods in complexity. So that can be rigorous qualitative methods and it doesn't necessarily mean replicating natural science approaches, because often those aren't useful in complex environments. But it does mean this rigorous approach to exploration, whatever that means, appropriate to the method that you're using. It says other things we notice is that the use of measurement and the use of data is crucial in this human learning systems approach and learning as a management strategy, because we need to use data to understand people's lives as systems, or how teams as systems are functioning, or how organizations as systems are functioning. And we need the rigorous use of data to understand what is happening with our experiments and explorations. But the crucial thing here, this is data for learning and adaptation, not for performance management. Some things I think that a human learning systems approach adds to and contributes to a quality improvement approach. One of the things that we found is that learning together requires effective learning relationships, and these learning relationships can be created or inhibited by the way that management works. So the crucial finding that we've encountered is that it is processes of learning together that build the trust between actors that enables autonomy to act on the ground. And this is this autonomy that gives space for the adaptation that is required to make public service bespoke for each and every person. One of the other key things we found is that it requires a different approach to scaling. So what we found is what can be scaled is the capacity for learning, not what is learnt in any given context. Because what complexity teaches us is that what is learnt in one context is right for that particular time and place. It's not necessarily right for other times and places. So I meant to give you a detailed discussion of this case study from the North Devon Pathology Service, where what they learned was that they did a bunch of experiments to test a different approach to blood tests, and a different package of blood tests that would give clinicians and patients a better information on which to make healthcare decisions. And they found what they thought was a better way of doing things, and then they said, okay, let's scale this to the other GP practices. But because those other GP practices hadn't been involved in that initial learning process, and what they'd got in their head was like an implementation mindset, that was the idea of scaling what was learned from other contexts was resisted by all the other GP practices. And so instead, what they did was they created an environment where all those other GP practices could undertake their own experiments, but crucially undertaking their own experiments off the back of the learning from the others. And so by creating this approach of scaling learning rather than scaling what is learned, they were able to spread what they'd found and move away from this idea of an implementation approach to scaling. Can say more about that if you're interested. Finally, what we've found is there is a really interesting relationship between a quality improvement approach and human learning systems. And so the approach that that we've seen from Healthcare Improvement Scotland of this kind of person-centered quality improvement, that provides a bunch of really helpful methods for person-centered public management. But the person-centered public management in return creates an enabling environment for those kind of learning processes to do their job properly. So what we're approaching, what we've kind of seen is that this is two sides of the same coin, and that if we can actively choose to do public management differently in a way that supports quality improvement. So that's maybe kind of a lot to take in at a conceptual level. I thought in my remaining time I'll give you just a couple of examples of this in practice so that you can see that everything that we've learned, everything that I've told you about today is built up from people who are doing this human learning systems approach in practice in different places. So I just thought I'd give you some examples of what that looks like. Firstly, I'll talk to you about the Plymouth Alliance example. So Plymouth Alliance is an alliance of health and social care organisations in Plymouth, working with the council and the health commissioners in the city. And what they did was created an £80 million 10-year commission for organisations to serve the health and social care needs of, in their language, adults with complex needs. So adults experiencing homelessness and substance misuse problems and involvement in the criminal justice system and mental health problems, that kind of complex constellation of challenges that people can experience in their lives. And they did this £80 million commission using an alliance contract, which created shared governance responsibilities between the commissioners and the providers. So it created this shared governance framework of mutual accountability. And the crucial bit of this this 10-year £80 million contract was it didn't have a single target and didn't have a single key performance indicator in it. What organisations were commissioned to do was to learn together to achieve shared purpose. So that is what they were held accountable for. The organisations under this contract were held accountable by one another for learning and collaborating together effectively to achieve the purpose of better lives for the people being served. And really interestingly, the outcome of this commissioning for learning and adaptation was significant cash savings. So, for example, they managed to halve the emergency accommodation budget for homeless families in 6 months, and combined with better outcomes for citizens. So they had fewer homeless people and greater recovery levels. So they managed to achieve that holy grail of better outcomes for people for less money. How did they do this? Well, they used a complexity-informed approach to data. So they used appreciative inquiry as a learning method. So they captured stories about people's lives that gave them pictures of whole-rounded human beings. And crucially, they used the measurement they had to undertake for collective sense-making, not for performance management. And it was this change in the performance management approach, switching from the idea of extrinsic motivation, you need a reward or carrot or stick to make you perform your job, to an intrinsic motivation sense of we give people mastery, autonomy, and purpose, and that is what motivates them. And what they did was systematically build empathy across the system. And it is this sense of sharing humanity amongst all of the workers and all of the people they serve gave that that sense of purpose for mastery, autonomy, purpose. And the crucial bit of this change was that they changed their accountability structures, shifting to this idea of accountability for learning. So moving away from performance targets, but it's substituting this rigorous processes for experimentation and exploration together. And finally, what they insisted on was complete financial transparency. So any organisation that were part of this alliance had to open their books to all of the other organisations. Second example I want to give you is the Innovation Centre from the Finnish National Education Agency. They talk about this this idea of humble government in Finland. where the role of national government is to create effective local learning systems. And so what National Education Agency did was say, our job is to support a culture of local learning and experimentation. And so did that, the Education Agency switched from a controlling role for local education systems to a learning partner role. And further, they conducted experiments with how they needed to behave differently as a national agency. And so again, how did they do this? They focused on their learning partner role of convening local system actors and building their capacity for learning and experimentation. So building design skills, data analysis, sense making. They changed their accountability structures. They replaced performance accountability with what they call multi-stakeholder dialogue, and again insisted on these rigorous processes for experimentation. They said you can't just try stuff and then retrospectively call it an experiment. To do an experiment means designing it like this and producing this kind of data, blah, blah, blah. And crucially, they practiced what they preach. They experimented with changing their own role, not just supporting local actors to change. So if this alternative approach to public management sounds interesting to you, you can download the guide that we developed in partnership with Healthcare Improvement Scotland. And crucially, if you do that, we'd love to get your feedback on it. And also you can ask for help if you need it with this approach. So if you're in Scotland, you can speak to the iHub at Healthcare Improvement Scotland or us at the Centre for Public Impact. And if you want to know more, there's plenty more information at the humanlearning.systems website. Thanks very much. I hope that has been interesting for you.
It has been fascinating, Toby. Thank you so much. As always, every time I listen to you, I learn more and more insights. So I'm going to introduce our guest questioner today, who is Diana Heckram. She's our Associate Director of Transformational Redesign here at the iHub at Healthcare Improvement Scotland. And Diana, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth, and thank you very much, Toby, as well. I learned a lot. And from our work together, one of the questions we often hear is about understanding how pressured staff feel working in health and social care, from the delivery teams to leaders. How would a manager support teams to experiment while still meeting those leadership governance requirements which aren't going to go away?
Thanks, Diana. I'll try and address different bits of your question in turn. So firstly, that point about that I heard you say about kind of pressured staff, and like particularly now, like health and social care staff feeling burnt out and kind of exhausted with all the things that are going on. Well, one of the things that we found in the work is that one of the kind of antidotes to that, people feeling burnt out, is a kind of sense of hope that things can change. And from the conversations that we've seen with people, this is a way to give people hope that things can change, because they're experiencing burnout because of the way that things are going at the moment, and they need a sense of hope that things can be different. And then the other things I would say is that in terms of where managers can start with this is, where's the energy for change? Because this type of radical change starts from a sense of dissonance for people. So where are there problems that are recognised as so intractable that the ways of doing things that people have done before, they know won't work. So if we do more of what we've been doing, this really hard problem, we know that won't shift. So the places to go for that this can be started from are where are those hardest problems, and where is there a real mandate for change and for doing things differently. And the final bit of your question about doing this kind of experimentation while meeting the governance existing kind of reporting and governance requirements, there's kind of two aspects to that. So say that one of the significant problems are the existing reporting and governance requirements. So at some point, unless we experiment with doing those things differently, then nothing will change. Because this is what we really mean by changing the public management paradigm, that what has to change eventually is the reporting and governance requirements. So we can make the reporting and governance requirements part of what people experiment with. So ask people, we can ask those to whom we owe accountability accounts, what information would help satisfy you that people are doing the right thing here? How can we involve you in the experiments that are happening so that you can get a sense of what these learning processes are? And so managers can seek permission to experiment with different governance arrangements as part of these experimental processes. And within that, there will always be some things that you can't change. There will always be some reporting requirements that people say, no, I absolutely need these figures and blah, blah, blah. And so what we've seen people do under those circumstances is to keep gathering that data and report them to others, but just not to use them as performance metrics and not to performance manage against them for themselves. So one of the things that the Plymouth Alliance did, for example, was government still made them report on some slightly daft metrics around completion of recovery programs, for example, by people experiencing substance abuse problems. So they continued to gather that data and they reported it on. They just said, okay, we're not going to use that as performance management data within our own local system, because we don't think it was telling us anything useful or relevant. And so there are ways that people can keep satisfying those reporting requirements and still find space for experimentation with doing things differently.
Great, thank you, Toby. The old both and, work in both paradigms at the same time. Thank you. The chat bot or the question box there's so many questions coming in. We're not going to get time to go through all of these this afternoon. So do encourage our listeners, please, to keep voting on the questions. So just so I get a sense as to where the interest is, though sometimes people ask a question early on that you then answer in the presentation, so I do sometimes skip ones that I think have already been covered. You've partly answered the one that's got the most votes, but just in case you want to say a bit more around this. So this is from James Mountford, who very much a friend of his, hello James, who is saying that he's sold on the logic, but he worries that in highly political systems, how does it survive the contact with the extreme pressure that leaders face from above in being seen to be tough on the problem? And I'm sure you know all of this about grip, pace, accountability. So how can we best create accountability for accelerating learning in highly political contexts?
Great question. Really, really love this question, and it gets to the heart of a bunch of the challenges of doing this at the kind of most kind of senior national level, certainly. So one of the sets of conversations that we've seen kind of engages politicians around this is to help them see like the ways in which they're seeking control of this stuff is actually counterproductive. So the desire to grip actually makes the problem that they're trying to grip worse. And because there's a whole bunch of really solid evidence about that kind of stuff. So kind of one useful kind of line of conversation with those folks is that do you really want to solve this problem, or do you want to pretend that you've got a grip of it? Because there's something of a kind of binary choice around that. The second thing that we've seen kind of interest in it is that this plays into politicians' interests, because when politicians pretend they're in control of stuff they're not in control of, it always comes back to bite them in the end. So, like with the classic Harold Macmillan quote, "What is it that brought me down? Events, dear boy." Right? That the part of the problem that politicians experience is that currently they are forced to pretend they're in control of stuff they're not in control. And this gives them a language to say, actually, I'm sick of pretending about this, because it is my pretending that makes this problem worse. And then the final kind of thing, the set of conversations that we've been having with people around this is that changing this stuff is a way to rebuild trust between the government and the public at large. Because at the moment, the public are being offered the idea that targets are the way for them for public service to be accountable to them, and people know that that's not true. So think about the Mid Staffordshire Hospital thing, where it was hitting all the targets and killing all the patients, right? And so people have got used to the idea that they know instinctively that what the evidence tells us, that the reported data against performance targets is largely nonsense. Right? So there is, that has created this disconnect between government discourse and what people experience in their day-to-day about public service. And what we can offer is a way to reconnect people's day-to-day experience of public service with what government is concerned with, because we can say, actually, yes, accountability is really important. Let's get some. What would it look like to genuinely make public service accountable to the people that it serves?
Great, thank you, Toby. A question here that's come in from Anonymous is, what do you feel can get in the way of co-designing services to respond to a person's unique and complex life? Is it feasible to do this on larger scale services?
So yeah, absolutely, it's feasible to do this on larger scale. So the Plymouth example would be that approach now is kind of rolled out across the whole city of Plymouth. So one of the things that there's a series of things that get in the way of that kind of co-designing taking place in the life of the person rather than kind of up here at a more strategic level. And those things are like standardized service specifications and pathways for things, right? Because every time someone writes, this is how this program is going to work, and this is the type of intervention that will happen at this level, then what they're saying is, I know absolutely what should happen in this person's life at this point. And there is no way that a person writing a service specification for a commission or a program pathway can possibly know what is the right thing to do in each person's unique life. So the fewer service specifications we write, the fewer pathways that we write, the better we will be able to produce bespoke responses for each and every person.
Thank you, Toby. And a question now from Ruth Robin. So focusing on learning in order to meet varying needs requires a different leadership style and management skills. What do you feel we need more of to facilitate this paradigm shift?
Amazing, great question. Thank you, Ruth. In fact, thank you, Ruth and Ruth. If I could like wave a magic wand and develop one characteristic amongst leaders, I suppose it would be curiosity. Because it is leaders who are curious about, oh, why is that happening like that? And that kind of starting from sense of, well, we don't know the answer to that, let's find out. It is kind of cultivating that characteristic of curiosity, I think, that was one of the key leadership traits that is probably least valued and least developed in the previous way of doing things, I would suggest.
Great, thank you. So curiosity is the main message there. And then this is a pre-submitted question that came in that's highlighting that learning seems to be a term that means different things to different people. Actually, it's quite an important point to define what we then mean by it. So they're asking, are there some key elements or characteristics that learning should or shouldn't have?
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the reasons why we tried to provide some kind of framework by which to understand what we mean in terms of learning as a management strategy. So there is the learning that takes place at the kind of understand the system phase of a learning cycle. So that is learning about, that's partly helping the actors in that system to see and understand one another as a system. So there's learning about the different people and organizations involved and learning the kind of different contributions that all of those organizations make to achieving a shared outcome. There is learning to work together and to trust one another in that. So and that is because one of the things that we see about this is that it's really easy for us to, when we get into thinking about learning, to think of learning as a technical process, something that we can proceduralize. And there are bits of it we can usefully proceduralize, but actually the kind of learning that we've seen is most effective is underpinned by really strong human relationships. And so learning about one another as human beings and having empathy for one another and curiosity about that stuff, that's a kind of crucial aspect to learning at the understand the system phase. And then the final bit of this is the bit that probably looks most like kind of traditional learning processes, which are, what do we know about the causal drivers in this system? And that's where we can make most use of experiments from other contexts and the more kind of traditional forms of research evidence, because we can draw on all of those things to give us a sense of how this system might operate. It is then the final bit of what we mean by kind of learning in that understand the system phase is what happens when those actors that you've identified in that system talk and reflect together about those factors that you've identified. So what is the shared contextual understanding that those people create about what is going on around here? And it is that learning process that not just builds trust between people, but then that is the thing that provides the kind of raw material for the question, what should we experiment with? Try differently? And that as a crucial learning phase sets up the potential for really meaty, focused kind of action research stuff that will make a difference in people's lives at whatever system scale. So we know quite a lot about what we think those learning processes look like at understand the system scale, understand the system phase rather, and then the learning processes around designing and running experiments and explorations will be really, really familiar to people, because we kind of know what like good data capture looks like, and we know what good sense making processes look like. If we've kind of outlined those in the practical guide that we pulled together, but yeah, I can't imagine anyone on this QI call needs a lot of reminding about what any of that stuff looks like.
But Toby, your definition of learning includes within it the concept of experimentation, because we all know I can learn that if I meditate every day, it's a better day. Doesn't mean that I do it.
No, exactly so, and it's why I'm fond of the phrase kind of action research in this context, because essentially what one of the interpretations of this is that we're saying that every public servant becomes an action researcher. So it is that process of active experimentation and exploration that really that is kind of 50% of this as a learning process that we're talked about. And the question that you asked there at the end about, okay, so what's changed? Like, what do we do differently as a result of this learning? That becomes a crucial part of then the governance process of those learning cycles. Because so if it is useful for people to check and what's changed as a result of all of this stuff, then we should be able to provide an account of that stuff, right? That is part of how this stuff is governed.
Brilliant. So the governance isn't just are you learning, it is how are you taking that learning and applying it and continuing to learn. And it's what we say in Scotland around the QI work, because the model for improvement, which is experimentation with data, is our foundation method, and that's how you work with complexity. It's the experimentation with data, which is a part of what you would say is critical for learning. Brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm going to squeeze one more very quick question in. I've run out of time, but we're going to try and just do it very quickly. You've done a lot of work with us in Scotland. So in terms of what you've observed from the work that you've done with us, What would you say are the main blockages to this approach that we need to address?
Ooh, interesting question. There can be fear of change. So this approach to doing public management differently is quite a radical change, because it requires rethinking almost everything about how management is done. And those people who are in a position to be able to really go, oh yeah, okay, we can experiment with doing this differently at a large scale, are largely in positions because they were really good at doing the old stuff well. So that's, if you rise to the top of things, it's because you're good at doing the things that system demands of you, right? And so we're asking people to change who have built their identity, their professional identities around working in one way. We're saying to them, things probably need to be different here, including the things that you might have spent 30 or 40 years learning to do well. And that kind of psychological challenge to some of our kind of most senior leaders is a really interesting one. What I would say is that the really exciting senior leaders that we've met are those that are up for that kind of change, and that like thinking that though it could be different on that kind of scale is one of the that's a reason that a senior lady should get paid the big bucks, right?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Toby. That has been amazing. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but thank you. Brilliant session.